The golden hour light filtered through the lace curtains of Margaret's small kitchen, casting dancing shadows across the worn wooden table where she sat with her 7-year-old granddaughter Lucy. The old house creaked gently in the evening breeze, its familiar sounds a comfort after all these years. Margaret's weathered hands, marked by decades of hard work and adorned with a simple gold wedding band that had grown loose with age, wrapped around a steaming cup of chamomile tea. Lucy sat cross-legged on the chair beside her, her small fingers tracing patterns on the faded tablecloth, her wide hazel eyes fixed on her grandmother's face with the kind of innocent curiosity that only children possess. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant sound of sparrows settling in for the night. "Grandma Maggie," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening symphony. "You look sad. Are you thinking about Grandpa again?" Margaret's pale blue eyes, clouded slightly with age but still sharp with intelligence, turned toward her granddaughter. A gentle smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, creating deeper creases in her already lined face. She reached out with one trembling hand to smooth Lucy's dark curls, the same color her own hair had been so many years ago. "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of decades, soft as velvet but strong as steel. "I was thinking about many things. About your grandfather, yes, but also about stories, about life, about how sometimes the most important truths are the ones that take the longest to understand." Lucy tilted her head, a gesture so reminiscent of her mother at that age that it made Margaret's heart skip a beat. "What kind of stories, Grandma?" Margaret set down her teacup with hands that shook slightly, not from fear, but from the accumulated weariness of her 82 years. The porcelain clinked softly against the saucer, a sound that seemed to echo in the quiet kitchen. Outside, the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, and she knew that soon the stars would appear, just as they had every night of her long life. "The kind of stories that explain why we are who we are, little one," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Stories about love and loss, about secrets and sacrifices, about standing up for what's right, even when it costs us everything we hold dear." Lucy's eyes grew even wider, if that were possible. She scooted her chair closer to her grandmother's, and Margaret could smell the lingering scent of strawberry shampoo in her hair, mixed with the innocent sweetness that seemed to surround all children. "Will you tell me one of those stories?" Lucy asked, reaching out to take Margaret's hand in both of her small ones. Her touch was warm and soft, and Margaret felt something inside her chest loosen, a knot of pain and regret that had been tied tight for far too long. Margaret looked down at their joined hands, seeing the contrast between her own spotted, wrinkled skin and Lucy's smooth, unmarked palms. She thought about all the hands she had held over the years. Her own children's when they were small, her husband Robert's during their 43 years of marriage, the hands of patients when she worked as a nurse, the hands of friends and neighbors and strangers who had needed comfort in their darkest hours. "I suppose," Margaret said slowly, "I could tell you about a time when everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be wrong, about a day when I lost almost everything, but discovered something that changed the way I saw the world forever." Lucy nodded eagerly, settling back in her chair but never letting go of Margaret's hand. The kitchen grew dimmer as the sun continued its descent, and Margaret reached over to turn on the small lamp that sat on the windowsill. Its warm yellow light created a circle of intimacy around them, shutting out the gathering darkness and making the rest of the world seem very far away. "It was 3 months ago," Margaret began, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, measured and deliberate. "The day we buried your grandfather, Robert. The church was full of people who had known and loved him. Friends from his work at the factory, neighbors from our street, members of our congregation. Everyone spoke about what a good man he was, how he had helped them in times of need, how his laugh could light up a room. Margaret paused, her free hand moving to touch the small silver locket that hung around her neck, hidden beneath her cardigan. Inside was a tiny photograph of Robert from their wedding day, his face young and hopeful, his eyes bright with love and dreams for their future together. But you know, Lucy, sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones who surprise us the most. Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about our lives aren't the whole truth. Lucy squeezed her grandmother's hand gently. What do you mean, Grandma Maggie? Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, and suddenly she was back in that cemetery, standing beside Robert's coffin as they lowered it into the ground. She could feel the autumn wind cutting through her black dress, could smell the earth and the flowers, and the faint scent of Robert's cologne that still lingered on the coat she wore. His coat, which she had put on that morning because she couldn't bear to leave any part of him behind. The funeral had been everything Robert would have wanted. Simple, dignified, filled with the hymns he had loved and the faces of people whose lives he had touched. Margaret had stood at the graveside, supported by her son David on one side and her daughter-in-law Patricia on the other, watching as the minister spoke words of comfort and hope. But even in her grief, Margaret had noticed something strange. David had been tense throughout the service, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes avoiding hers. Patricia kept glancing at him nervously, and once Margaret had caught them whispering urgently to each other during the closing prayer. After the service, as people began to drift away, David had walked Margaret to the black sedan that would take them back to her house. His face was set in hard lines, and when he spoke, his voice was colder than she had ever heard it. "Mom," he had said, not meeting her eyes, "we need to talk. About the house. About your situation." Margaret had looked at him in confusion, her mind still foggy with grief and exhaustion. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I mean," David had said, his words clipped and businesslike, "that it's time for you to face reality. Dad's gone. The house is too big for you. You can't take care of yourself anymore. Patricia and I have found a nice assisted living facility about an hour from here. They have an opening next month." Margaret had felt as though the ground beneath her feet was shifting, as though the very world was tilting sideways. "David, I don't understand. Your father and we always planned. I thought I would stay in our home, with our memories." "Mom, be practical," David had said, and there was something in his tone that she had never heard before. Impatience, yes, but something else. Something that sounded almost like anger. "The house needs work. The roof, the plumbing, the electrical system, it's going to cost a fortune to maintain. And frankly, you don't have that kind of money." "But the life insurance?" Margaret had said weakly. "Your father's pension." David had exchanged a look with Patricia, and Margaret had seen something pass between them, a look of knowledge, of secrets shared. "We'll discuss all of that later," he had said. "Right now, you need to start thinking about packing. I'll help you sort through Dad's things this week." "That must have been very scary, Grandma," Lucy said softly, her young voice pulling Margaret back to the present. "When Uncle David said those things." Margaret nodded, tears beginning to gather in her eyes as she remembered that terrible day. "It was, sweetheart. You see, I had just lost the love of my life, the man I had shared everything with for more than 4 decades. And suddenly, my own son was telling me that I had to leave the only home I had known for 35 years. It felt like losing Robert all over again." She paused to wipe her eyes with a tissue from the box on the table, then continued. "But you know what the strangest part was? David wouldn't look at me. Not really. He kept glancing away, checking his watch, acting like he wanted to be anywhere but there with his grieving mother. And Patricia, she just stood there saying nothing, wringing her hands and looking guilty about something. Lucy's brow furrowed in the way children's do when they're trying to understand something complex. Why were they acting so weird, Grandma? That, my dear, Margaret said with a sad smile, is exactly what I wanted to know. The next few days had passed in a blur of casseroles from neighbors, phone calls from well-meaning friends, and the terrible echoing silence of a house that had always been filled with Robert's presence. Margaret had moved through her daily routines like a ghost, making coffee for one instead of two, setting the table for a single person, talking to Robert's empty chair as if he might suddenly materialize and ask her about her day. But even through her grief, she had been unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. David's behavior at the funeral had been so out of character, so cold and businesslike. This was the same son who had called every Sunday without fail, who had brought his children over for dinner every month, who had always sought her advice about everything from job decisions to parenting challenges. 3 days after the funeral, David had arrived at Margaret's house with a stack of official-looking papers and a grim expression. He had barely hugged her hello before spreading the documents across the kitchen table. The same table where Margaret now sat with Lucy, telling this story. "Mom, I need you to sign these," he had said without preamble, his voice businesslike and distant. Margaret had put on her reading glasses and tried to make sense of the legal language. "What are they, David?" "Papers transferring power of attorney to me, and this one gives me authority to handle Dad's estate and your finances. It's standard procedure, Mom. Everyone does it." Something in his tone had set off alarm bells in Margaret's mind. She had raised 4 children and worked as a nurse for 30 years. She knew when someone was being less than truthful. "David, I'm perfectly capable of handling my own affairs. I'm grieving, not incompetent." "Mom, please." David's voice had taken on an edge of irritation. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Patricia and I are trying to help you. We're trying to take care of everything so you don't have to worry about it." "But I want to worry about it," Margaret had said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "This is my life, my home, my husband's legacy. I need to understand what's happening." David had run his hands through his hair, a gesture she remembered from his childhood when he was frustrated or trying to hide something. "Look, Mom, the bottom line is this. Dad left some debts. More than you know. The house might need to be sold to pay them off. I'm trying to save you from having to deal with all the legal mess, but I need your cooperation." Margaret had stared at her son, feeling as though she was looking at a stranger. "Debts? What debts?" "Robert and I never carried debt except for the mortgage, and that was paid off 10 years ago. Medical bills, Mom, credit cards, some business investments that went bad. He was trying to protect you from worrying about money, but there's more debt than assets." The words had hit Margaret like physical blows. Robert, secretive about money? Robert, who had balanced their checkbook every month and discussed every major purchase with her? Robert, who had been as honest and straightforward as the day was long. "I don't believe you," she had said quietly. David's face had flushed red. "Mom, I'm trying to help you here. Dad asked me to take care of you if anything happened to him. This is me taking care of you." "Then show me the papers," Margaret had said. "Show me these debts. Show me the medical bills and the credit card statements and these mysterious business investments." "I was married to your father for 43 years, David. I think I would have known if we were in financial trouble." David had gathered up the papers quickly, his movements sharp and angry. "Fine. I'll get you copies of everything. But Mom, you need to start accepting reality. The house is going to have to be sold. You're going to have to move. And the sooner you sign these papers and let me handle everything, the easier it's going to be for everyone involved." He had left without saying goodbye, and Margaret had stood at the kitchen window watching his car disappear down the street, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. "That's when I knew something was very wrong," Margaret told Lucy, her voice growing stronger as she remembered that moment of clarity. "You see, sweetheart, your grandfather Robert was many things, but secretive was not one of them. He couldn't even keep birthday presents hidden. He'd get so excited about giving them to me that he'd drop hints for weeks beforehand." Lucy giggled softly at this, and Margaret smiled at the sound. It was so easy to forget, in the midst of pain and loss, that there could still be moments of lightness. "So, what did you do, Grandma?" "I did what any self-respecting woman who had been married to a man for 43 years would do," Margaret said with a glint in her eye that reminded Lucy strongly of her mother's expression when she was being mischievous. "I decided to do some investigating of my own." Margaret had always been an organized person, a trait that had served her well during her nursing career, and as a mother of 4 children. Robert used to tease her about her filing system, saying she could probably locate any document in their house within 5 minutes. Now, that organizational skill was about to become her greatest asset. The next morning, after a sleepless night of worrying and wondering, Margaret had gone into Robert's study, a small room at the back of the house that he had claimed as his own space for reading, watching television, and handling their finances. She had barely been in there since his death. The room still smelled like his aftershave and the pipe tobacco he had occasionally enjoyed on weekend evenings. Margaret had stood in the doorway for a long moment, her hand on the light switch, feeling Robert's presence so strongly it was almost like he was sitting in his favorite armchair, looking up at her over his reading glasses with that gentle, patient expression he had worn whenever she interrupted his quiet time. "Oh, Robert," she had whispered to the empty room, "I wish you were here to explain all this to me." Then she had taken a deep breath, turned on the light, and gotten to work. Robert's desk was as neat and organized as everything else in his life had been. Bills were filed in labeled folders, bank statements were arranged chronologically, and his checkbook was balanced to the penny. Margaret had spent hours going through everything, making notes, cross-referencing dates and amounts. What she found had made her blood run cold. There were no mysterious debts, no unpaid medical bills beyond the small copays from Robert's regular doctor visits, no credit card balances. They had always paid off their cards in full every month. No failed business investments. But there were other things that made her hands shake as she read them. Bank statements showing large withdrawals from their savings account, withdrawals that Margaret had never authorized and had never seen. The amounts were significant. $5,000 here, $3,000 there, $10,000 in a single transaction just 2 months before Robert's death. Each withdrawal was accompanied by a deposit slip showing the money being transferred into a different account, an account that bore David and Patricia's names. Margaret had stared at the papers, her mind reeling. The dates of the withdrawals corresponded with visits from David and Patricia, times when they had come for dinner or Sunday afternoon visits. She remembered now how David had always found excuses to spend time alone with his father, how they would disappear into Robert's study for long conversations about business and investments. There were other documents, too. A life insurance policy that Margaret had never seen before, with David listed as the primary beneficiary. A deed showing that David had been added to the title of their house. Papers that looked official and legal, but that Margaret was certain she had never signed. And at the bottom of Robert's filing cabinet, hidden beneath folders of old tax returns, Margaret had found something that had made her sink into Robert's desk chair and weep. A letter written in Robert's careful handwriting, dated just 1 week before his death. "What did the letter say, Grandma?" Lucy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had been listening with the complete attention that only children can give to a story, and Margaret could see in her granddaughter's eyes the same sharp intelligence that had always run in their family. Margaret closed her eyes, and she could see the letter as clearly as if it were spread out before her again. Robert's handwriting, always so precise, though it had grown shakier in his final months. His words so full of love and pain and desperate hope. The letter, Margaret said slowly, was addressed to me. It said, "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I pray that you will find it in your heart to forgive me. I have made terrible mistakes, and I fear that in my weakness I have put you in danger." Margaret paused, remembering how her hands had trembled as she read those words. He went on to explain that David had come to him months earlier, claiming to be in serious financial trouble. He said that David owed money to dangerous people, that his business was failing, that he was going to lose his house and his family if he couldn't come up with cash quickly. Lucy's eyes were wide with shock. "But that wasn't true, was it, Grandma?" "No, sweetheart, it wasn't true at all. But your grandfather didn't know that. He only knew that his oldest son was asking for help, and Robert had never been able to say no to any of his children when they truly needed him." Margaret remembered how Robert had always been the soft touch when the children were growing up. If they needed money for school clothes or wanted to go on a class trip they couldn't afford, it was always Robert who found a way to make it happen. Margaret had been the practical one, the one who made them earn their allowances and save their money. But Robert had given from his heart without question. The letter explained how David had convinced him to take out loans against the house, to withdraw money from their retirement accounts, even to change the beneficiary on his life insurance policy. All of it was supposed to be temporary. David promised he would pay it all back once his business recovered.
Margaret's voice grew bitter as she continued. But of course, there was no failing business. David and Patricia had been living well beyond their means for years, buying expensive cars and taking elaborate vacations and sending their children to private schools they couldn't afford. And when the bills came due, instead of cutting back on their lifestyle, they decided to steal from the two people who loved them most. Margaret had sat in Robert's study until well past midnight, reading and rereading that letter, going through every document, trying to understand how their lives had been so completely undermined by their own son. The letter explained everything: how David had gradually isolated Robert from his financial decisions, how he had convinced him that Margaret was too fragile to handle the stress of knowing about their supposed financial troubles, how he had played on Robert's love and trust until he had signed away nearly everything they had worked for during their entire marriage. The worst part was the end of the letter, where Robert had written, "I know now that David was lying to me. I overheard him on the phone yesterday talking to Patricia about their new boat and laughing about how easy it was to get the old man to sign papers. I confronted him, and he became angry and told me that if I tried to back out now, he would make sure you ended up in a nursing home where you couldn't cause any trouble. Margaret, my darling, I don't know what to do. I am old and sick and afraid, and I fear I have put you in terrible danger. If anything happens to me, please know that I love you more than life itself, and I am so sorry for failing to protect you." Margaret had wept then, great gasping sobs that shook her entire body. She wept for Robert, who had died carrying this terrible burden alone. She wept for the betrayal by their son, whom they had loved and trusted completely. She wept for her own naivety, for not seeing the signs, for not asking the right questions. But after the tears had dried, something else had taken their place. Something Robert would have recognized, the steel backbone that had gotten Margaret through nursing school when everyone said women shouldn't be in medicine. That had helped her raise 4 children while working full-time. That had seen her through every crisis and challenge of their long marriage. David thought she was a helpless old woman. He thought he could intimidate her into signing papers and quietly disappearing into some nursing home where she wouldn't be able to cause trouble. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. "What did you do then, Grandma Maggie?" Lucy asked, her small hand still holding tight to Margaret's. Margaret smiled, and for a moment Lucy could see a flash of the young, strong woman her grandmother had once been. "I did what your grandfather would have wanted me to do, sweetheart. I fought back." The next morning, Margaret had dressed carefully in her best navy blue suit, the one she had worn to church every Sunday for the past 15 years, the one that made her feel confident and capable. She had styled her silver hair, put on her pearl earrings, and applied her lipstick with the same precision she had once used to prepare medications for patients. Then she had driven to the offices of Henderson and Associates, the law firm that had handled her and Robert's legal affairs for more than 20 years. Harold Henderson had been surprised to see her so soon after Robert's funeral, and his expression had grown increasingly grave as Margaret laid out the documents she had found. He had examined each paper carefully, his bushy eyebrows drawing together in a frown that deepened with each new piece of evidence. "Margaret," he had said finally, removing his glasses and cleaning them with hands that shook slightly with age, "I'm going to ask you a very direct question, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Did you sign any of these documents?" "No, Harold, I did not." "Are you certain? Even this one transferring partial ownership of your house to David? Your signature appears to be on it, and it's been notarized." Margaret had looked at the document again, studying the signature that looked very much like her own handwriting. Then she had opened her purse and pulled out a small notebook, her address book, filled with decades of contacts written in her own careful script. "Harold, I've been writing the same way for 60 years. Look at the M in Margaret on that document, then look at how I write my M's in this address book. Do you see the difference?" Harold had studied both samples carefully, then nodded grimly. "The forged signature shows a slight tremor that's not present in your natural handwriting. And the loop on the G is different. My son forged my signature, Harold. He stole our money, he lied to his father, and he forged legal documents to steal our home. What can we do about it?" Harold had been quiet for a long moment, staring out the window of his office toward the courthouse across the street. Finally, he had turned back to Margaret with a look of determination. "We can fight this, Margaret. It won't be easy, and it won't be pleasant. You're talking about pressing criminal charges against your own son. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret had thought about Robert's letter, about his fear and shame, about the way David had looked at her at the funeral, not with love or grief, but with cold calculation. She had thought about all the years she had spent raising him, loving him, sacrificing for him. She had thought about the other children. Would they believe David's lies about her? Would she lose not just one son, but all of her children? Then she had thought about what Robert would want her to do. Robert, who had believed in honesty and integrity above all else. Robert, who had taught their children to take responsibility for their mistakes and to always tell the truth. "Yes, Harold," she had said firmly. "I'm prepared." "Weren't you scared, Grandma?" Lucy asked. "I would have been scared." Margaret reached out to smooth a curl away from Lucy's face. "Oh, I was terrified, sweetheart. But sometimes being scared is not a reason to avoid doing what's right. Sometimes being scared is just a sign that what you're about to do is very important." The legal battle had taken weeks to unfold. Harold Henderson had worked with the police to build a case for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. The bank records were subpoenaed, handwriting experts were called in to examine the forged signatures. And slowly, the full extent of David and Patricia's theft began to emerge. They had taken nearly $200,000 from Robert and Margaret's accounts over the course of 18 months. They had forged documents to add their names to the deed of the house. They had even taken out credit cards in Robert's name without his knowledge, running up debts that would have left Margaret destitute. The confrontation had come on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after Margaret's visit to Harold Henderson's office. David had arrived at her house unannounced, carrying another stack of papers and wearing an expression of barely controlled anger. "Mom, what the hell do you think you're doing?" he had demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "I just got a call from some lawyer asking questions about our family's financial arrangements. And the bank called Patricia wanting to discuss irregularities in Dad's accounts." Margaret had been ready for this moment. She had rehearsed what she would say, how she would remain calm and dignified no matter how ugly David became. She was sitting at her kitchen table, this very table where she now sat with Lucy, and she had gestured for David to take a seat across from her. "I think you know exactly what I'm doing. David, I'm trying to understand how you stole nearly $200,000 from your father and me." David's face had gone white, then flushed red. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mom. You're confused. You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking very clearly for the first time in months," Margaret had said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was pounding. "I found your father's letter, David. I know what you did to him. I know how you lied to him, how you convinced him to give you money by claiming you were in trouble, how you forged my signature on legal documents. You can't prove any of that," David had said, but his voice had lost its bluster. He was looking at her now with something that might have been fear. "Actually, I can. Bank records, handwriting analysis, phone records of calls between you and Patricia discussing your investment strategy. Harold Henderson has been very thorough." David had slumped in his chair then, and for a moment, he had looked like the little boy she remembered, the one who used to come to her when he scraped his knee or had nightmares. "Mom," he had said quietly, "you don't understand. We were drowning. The business was failing. Patricia lost her job. The kids needed things. We were going to pay it all back once we got back on our feet, by putting your father and me on the street." Margaret had asked. "By convincing him to sign away our home, our life savings, our security? By planning to put me in a nursing home so I couldn't cause trouble?" David's head had snapped up at that, his eyes wide with shock that she knew about that conversation. "David," Margaret had continued, her voice growing stronger, "your father died believing he had failed me. He died carrying the weight of what you had convinced him to do, afraid to tell me the truth, terrified of what would happen to me after he was gone. You not only stole our money, you stole his peace of mind in his final days." David had begun to cry then, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. We just needed a little help, and then it got out of control, and I didn't know how to stop it." Margaret had felt her heart breaking as she watched her son weep. This was the child she had rocked to sleep, whose fever she had stayed up all night to break, whose scraped knees she had bandaged, and whose broken heart she had comforted when his high school girlfriend broke up with him. But this was also the man who had systematically stolen from his dying father, who had forged her signature, who had planned to have her declared incompetent so he could control her assets. "I love you, David," she had said quietly. "I will always love you because you are my son, but I cannot and will not let you get away with what you've done. You're going to return every penny you stole. You're going to sign papers giving up any claim to this house or to your father's estate. And you're going to turn yourself into the police, and if I don't?" David had asked, though they both knew he already had his answer. "Then Harold Henderson will press charges for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. You'll go to prison. Patricia will likely face charges as well. And your children will grow up knowing their parents are criminals." David had sat in silence for a long time, tears still streaming down his face. Finally, he had nodded. "I'll need time to liquidate some assets, to get the money together. You have 30 days, Margaret had said. "And David?" If you try to hide money or transfer assets to avoid paying what you owe, I will make sure you face the full legal consequences of what you've done. I raised you better than this, and I know your father would expect you to take responsibility for your actions." David had left that day without saying goodbye, and Margaret had not seen him since. "Did Uncle David give you the money back, Grandma?" Lucy asked. Margaret nodded slowly. "He did, sweetheart. Not all of it. Some had already been spent on things that couldn't be returned, but most of it. Enough for me to keep this house, to live comfortably, to make sure I could take care of myself without being a burden on anyone." "What about Uncle David? Did he go to jail?" "No, Lucy, because I had most of my money back and because Harold Henderson convinced the prosecutor that David was genuinely remorseful. He was allowed to plead guilty to a reduced charge and received probation and community service. But he and Patricia had to sell their house to pay back what they owed, and they moved away. I haven't spoken to them since that day in my kitchen." Lucy was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Are you sad that Uncle David moved away?" Margaret considered the question carefully. It was one she had asked herself many times over the past 3 months. "I'm sad about many things, sweetheart. I'm sad that your uncle made such terrible choices. I'm sad that your grandfather died thinking he had failed me. I'm sad that David's children, your cousins, had to move away and change schools because of their parents' mistakes." She paused, looking out the window where the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "But I'm not sad that I fought back. I'm not sad that I stood up for myself and for your grandfather's memory. And I'm not sad that I'm still here, in this house, with these memories and these stories to share with you." Lucy squeezed her grandmother's hand tighter. "I'm glad you're still here too, Grandma Maggie." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different tears than the ones she had shed over the past months. These were tears of gratitude, of love, of hope for the future. "You know, Lucy," she said, "there's something else I learned from all of this. Something important." "What's that?" "I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who can hurt us the deepest. But I also learned that we don't have to let that hurt define us. We can choose to be stronger, to be better, to stand up for what's right even when it's painful." Margaret stood up slowly, her joints protesting after sitting in one position for so long. She walked to the kitchen counter and picked up a small wooden box that had been sitting there, nearly hidden behind a stack of mail. "This belonged to your grandfather," she said, returning to her seat and placing the box on the table between them. "He gave it to me on our wedding day, along with a promise." Lucy leaned forward eagerly as Margaret opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a simple silver compass. "He said that no matter where life took us, no matter what challenges we faced or what storms we weathered, this compass would always point us toward true north, toward what was right and good and honest." Margaret picked up the compass and placed it in Lucy's small hands. The metal was warm from being held, and Lucy could feel its weight, not just the physical weight of the silver, but the weight of all the years and stories it represented. "Your grandfather carried this compass with him during the war, when he was scared and far from home. I carried it in my pocket during the hardest days of my nursing career, when I had to make difficult decisions about patient care. And I held it in my hand the day I decided to fight back against your Uncle David." "What did it tell you?" Lucy asked, her voice filled with wonder. "It told me that the right thing to do isn't always the easy thing to do. It told me that sometimes love means setting boundaries, even with the people we care about most. And it told me that I was stronger than I ever imagined I could be." Margaret watched as Lucy turned the compass over in her hands, studying its worn surface and faded engravings. The child's face was serious, thoughtful in a way that reminded Margaret of herself at that age. "Grandma Maggie," Lucy said slowly, "do you think Uncle David will ever come back? Do you think he'll say he's sorry?" It was the question Margaret had been dreading, the one she knew would come eventually. She had spent countless sleepless nights wondering the same thing, staring at the ceiling and imagining different scenarios. David calling to apologize. David showing up at her door with his children, begging for forgiveness. David never speaking to her again, carrying his shame and anger to his grave. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly. "I hope so, because I miss the son I raised, the little boy who used to help me bake cookies and who cried when he accidentally stepped on a butterfly. But the man who stole from his dying father, I don't know if that man has the courage to face what he's done." Lucy nodded solemnly, then surprised Margaret by standing up and walking around the table to wrap her small arms around her grandmother's shoulders. "I love you, Grandma Maggie," she whispered into Margaret's ear. "And I think you're the bravest person I know." Margaret held her granddaughter close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair and feeling the steady beat of her young heart against her chest. In that moment, she understood something she hadn't fully grasped before, that this was why she had fought so hard to keep her home, to preserve her independence, to stand up for herself against David's manipulation, not just for her own sake, but for moments like this, for the chance to be here, in this kitchen, sharing stories and wisdom with the next generation. "Lucy," she said softly, "there's one more part of this story I need to tell you. The most important part." Lucy pulled back to look at her grandmother's face, her hazel eyes bright with curiosity. "After everything that happened with your Uncle David, after I got most of the money back and the legal papers were straightened out, I thought I would feel victorious. I thought I would feel proud of myself for standing up to someone who tried to take advantage of me." Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. This was the heart of the lesson she wanted to share, the wisdom that had taken her 82 years to fully understand. "But you know what I felt instead? I felt empty, hollow, because winning a fight against someone you love doesn't feel like winning at all. It feels like losing something precious that you can never get back." The weeks following David's departure had been some of the loneliest of Margaret's life. The house, which had always been filled with the sounds of family children's laughter, conversations over dinner, the comfortable noise of people who belonged together, had become eerily quiet. Margaret found herself talking to Robert's photograph more and more, asking him what she should have done differently, wondering if there had been another way to handle the situation. The other children had called, of course. Michael, her youngest son, had been supportive but distant, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama. Sarah, her middle daughter, had cried on the phone and asked if there wasn't some way to work things out with David. Even Jennifer, her eldest daughter who lived across the country, had flown in for a weekend to make sure her mother was all right, but none of them fully understood what Margaret had been through. They hadn't read Robert's letter or seen the fear in his handwriting. They hadn't spent hours going through forged documents or sat across from David as he tried to justify stealing from his own parents. They saw only that their brother was gone, their family was fractured, and their mother was alone. Margaret had tried to explain, had shared copies of the legal documents and bank statements, but she could see in their eyes that they thought she might have overreacted, that maybe somehow this could have been resolved within the family without lawyers and police reports and formal charges. "Mom," Sarah had said during one particularly difficult phone conversation, "I understand that David made mistakes, but he's family. Couldn't you have just worked something out?" Margaret had felt the familiar weight of being misunderstood settling on her shoulders. "Sarah, your brother didn't make mistakes. He made deliberate choices to lie, steal, and manipulate. He forged my signature on legal documents. He convinced your father to sign away our security and then laughed about how easy it was to fool an old man. But Mom, he's sorry now. And he paid most of the money back. Maybe it's time to what?" Margaret had interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "To pretend it never happened? To welcome him back with open arms and wait for him to do it again when he runs short of money?" The conversation had ended badly, with Sarah in tears and Margaret feeling like she was losing not just David, but all of her children. They wanted her to be the peacemaker, the mother who smoothed over conflicts and kept the family together at any cost. They didn't understand that sometimes the cost of keeping peace is too high. That sounds really lonely, Grandma, Lucy said softly, her small hand finding Margaret's again. It was lonely, sweetheart. There were days when I wondered if I had made the right choice. Days when I thought about calling David and telling him all was forgiven, just so I could have my family back together. But you didn't, no? I didn't, because every time I thought about giving in, I would remember your grandfather's letter. I would remember how he died carrying that burden of shame and fear. And I would remember that sometimes doing the right thing means being willing to be lonely. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the small garden that she and Robert had tended together for so many years. The tomato plants were heavy with fruit now, and the marigolds they had planted around the border were blooming in bright orange and yellow clusters. Even in the gathering darkness, she could see the results of decades of careful tending, of love translated into soil and seed and patient nurturing. But you know what I discovered, Lucy? I discovered that being alone isn't the same thing as being lonely. I discovered that I could be happy here, in this house, with my memories and my books and my garden. I discovered that I didn't need other people to validate my choices in order for those choices to be right. Lucy had followed her to the window and now stood beside her, both of them looking out at the garden. Is that when I started coming to visit you more? Margaret smiled and put her arm around her granddaughter's shoulders. That's exactly when you started coming to visit me more. Your mother, my wonderful daughter-in-law Jennifer, she understood what the others didn't. She understood that standing up for yourself doesn't make you wrong, even if it makes other people uncomfortable. It had been Jennifer who had suggested that Lucy start spending more time with Margaret. Jennifer had been the one to see past the family drama to the heart of the matter, that Margaret was a woman of integrity who had been betrayed by someone she trusted, and that she deserved support, not judgment. Mom, Jennifer had said, and Margaret's heart always warmed when Jennifer called her mom. Even though she was technically a daughter-in-law, I want Lucy to know her grandmother. I want her to learn from you. I want her to understand that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand alone for what's right. And so Lucy had started coming for weekend visits, then longer stays during school breaks. Margaret had worried at first that a 7-year-old would be bored in the quiet house of an old woman. But Lucy had surprised her with her curiosity, her intelligence, and her genuine enjoyment of simple pleasures like helping in the garden or learning to knit or listening to stories about the old days. Lucy never asked directly about the trouble with David. Children have a way of sensing when topics are too painful to discuss, but she seemed to understand instinctively that her grandmother needed companionship, needed someone to share meals with and laugh with and simply be present with. Through Lucy, Margaret had rediscovered joy. She had remembered what it felt like to see the world through young eyes, to find wonder in everyday things, to believe in the possibility of happy endings even after experiencing profound disappointment. Lucy's presence had also given Margaret a sense of purpose that she had lost after Robert's death. She wasn't just existing anymore, marking time until her own death. She was teaching, sharing wisdom, helping to shape a young mind and heart. She was making sure that the lessons she and Robert had learned about honesty, courage, integrity, and love would be passed down to the next generation. Grandma Maggie, Lucy said, still looking out at the garden, do you think Uncle David misses you? It was another of those questions that cut straight to the heart of things. Margaret had wondered the same thing many times, usually late at night when the house was quiet and her mind wandered to thoughts of her scattered family. I think he probably does, sweetheart. But I think he's also angry with me, and probably ashamed of himself, and those feelings are probably stronger than the missing right now. Will he ever not be angry and ashamed? Margaret turned away from the window and looked at her granddaughter, really looked at her. Lucy was growing up so fast. In the months since she had started visiting regularly, Margaret had watched her lose a tooth, learn to ride a bicycle, and read her first chapter book. She was becoming a person with her own thoughts and opinions and moral compass, I hope so, Lucy. I hope that someday David will be able to face what he did and find a way to make peace with it. I hope that someday you'll understand that what I did wasn't meant to hurt him, but to protect myself and to honor your grandfather's memory, and if he doesn't. Margaret smiled and reached out to touch Lucy's cheek gently. Then that will be his loss, not mine. Because I've learned something important in these past few months. I've learned that you can't control other people's choices, but you can control your own. And I choose to live with integrity, even when it's difficult. I choose to stand up for what's right, even when it costs me relationships. And I choose to find joy and purpose in the life I have. Rather than mourning the life I thought I was supposed to have, they stood together in comfortable silence for a few moments. Grandmother and granddaughter, looking out at the garden where fireflies were beginning to blink among the vegetables and flowers. The evening air was warm and soft, carrying the scent of roses and the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. Lucy, Margaret said finally, do you understand why I told you this story? Lucy considered the question seriously, her young brow furrowed in concentration. Because you want me to know that it's important to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's part of it, yes. But there's more. Margaret led Lucy back to the table and sat down, pulling the compass toward them again. The metal caught the light from the lamp, sending small reflections dancing across the walls. I told you this story because someday you're going to face a situation where someone you love and trust tries to take advantage of you. It might be a friend who asks you to lie for them, or a boyfriend who pressures you to do something you're not comfortable with, or even a family member who asks you to keep a secret that hurts someone else. Lucy nodded solemnly, understanding that this was important grown-up wisdom being shared with her. And when that happens, Margaret continued, I want you to remember this compass. I want you to remember that doing the right thing isn't always the popular thing or the easy thing or the thing that makes everyone happy, but it's always the thing that lets you sleep peacefully at night, knowing that you acted with integrity and courage. Margaret picked up the compass and placed it in Lucy's hands again. This is yours now, sweetheart. Your grandfather would want you to have it. Lucy's eyes went wide with surprise and something that looked like awe. Really? Are you sure? I'm very sure. This compass has guided 3 generations of our family toward what's right and good. Now it's your turn to carry it and to let it guide you. Lucy held the compass carefully, as if it were made of spun glass rather than sturdy silver. What if I make mistakes, Grandma? What if I don't always know what the right thing to do is? Margaret laughed softly and pulled Lucy into another embrace. Oh, my dear child, you will absolutely make mistakes. We all do. I've made more mistakes in my 82 years than I could count. But the compass doesn't make you perfect, it just helps you find your way back to true north when you've gotten lost. Like when you found Grandpa's letter and decided to fight back? Exactly like that. I was lost and confused and scared. But when I held this compass and thought about what your grandfather would want me to do, I knew which direction to go. They sat together as the last light faded from the sky, the compass between them on the table, the weight of family history and shared love settling around them like a comfortable blanket. Margaret felt a deep sense of peace, not the peace of someone who had won a victory, but the peace of someone who had stayed true to their principles despite the cost. Grandma Maggie, Lucy said sleepily, leaning against Margaret's shoulder, I'm glad you didn't let Uncle David scare you into leaving this house. I like coming here and hearing your stories. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but these were tears of gratitude and joy. I'm glad too, sweetheart. This old house has seen a lot of sadness lately, but having you here fills it with happiness again. Will you tell me more stories? About when you were young, and about Grandpa, and about the olden days. As many as you want to hear, Margaret promised. We have all the time in the world. Outside, the night sounds of summer surrounded the little house crickets and tree frogs, the distant sound of a train whistle, the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Inside, an old woman and a young girl sat together in the lamplight, connected by love and blood and the kind of trust that can only exist between generations. Margaret looked around the kitchen that had almost been lost to her, the kitchen where she had raised her children and cooked thousands of meals and celebrated birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings. She thought about how close she had come to losing it all, not just the house, but her dignity, her independence, her sense of who she was, but she had fought for it. She had found the courage to stand up to someone she loved, to demand the truth even when it was painful, to choose integrity over peace and self-respect over family harmony. And now she was here, in this moment, with this precious child who would carry forward the lessons and values that she and Robert had tried so hard to instill in their family. "Lucy," she said softly, "there's one more thing I want you to remember about this story." Lucy looked up at her expectantly. "I want you to remember that real love sometimes means saying no. It means setting boundaries. It means refusing to let someone hurt you, even if that someone is family. Your Uncle David told himself that he loved us, but what he did wasn't loving. It was selfish and cruel and destructive." Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. This was perhaps the most important lesson of all, and she wanted to make sure Lucy understood it completely. Real love protects the people we care about. It tells the truth, even when the truth is difficult. It takes responsibility for mistakes and works to make things right. It doesn't ask us to sacrifice our safety or our dignity or our peace of mind. Lucy nodded seriously. "So when someone says they love you, but they try to hurt you or make you do things you don't want to do, that's not really love." "That's exactly right, sweetheart. That's not love at all, no matter what they call it." Margaret felt a profound sense of completion as she spoke those words. This was why she had endured the loneliness and the family conflict and the legal battles. This was why she had refused to be intimidated into silence or compliance, not just to protect herself, but to teach this lesson to the next generation, to make sure that Lucy would grow up understanding the difference between love and manipulation, between family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior. The clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, and Margaret realized that Lucy's mother would be coming to pick her up soon. Their weekend together was coming to an end, but the story would remain. The lessons would remain. The compass would remain, passing from one generation to the next like a sacred trust. "Grandma Maggie," Lucy said, carefully tucking the compass into her small purse, "when I grow up, I want to be brave like you." Margaret smiled and kissed the top of Lucy's head. "You already are brave, sweetheart. You're brave enough to listen to difficult stories, to ask hard questions, to care about doing what's right. That's the kind of bravery that matters most." As if summoned by the clock's chiming, they heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Jennifer had arrived to take Lucy home, but Margaret knew that her granddaughter would be back soon. They had established something precious here in this kitchen, something that would endure long after the pain of the past few months had faded. Lucy hugged Margaret tightly before gathering her things. "Thank you for telling me the story, Grandma, and thank you for the compass. I'll take good care of it. I know you will, dear one. And Lucy, remember that you can call me anytime, day or night, if you ever need someone to help you find your way back to true north." After Lucy and Jennifer left, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling around her. The lamp cast a warm circle of light on the table where 2 teacups sat, evidence of the evening's conversation. She could still feel the echo of Lucy's small hand in hers, could still hear the sound of her granddaughter's voice asking thoughtful questions and absorbing wisdom with the seriousness that children bring to truly important matters. Margaret rose slowly and began to clear the table, washing the teacups and putting them away in the cabinet where they belonged. As she worked, she found herself humming an old hymn that Robert had loved, one they had sung together in church for more than 4 decades. She thought about the letter that had started this whole journey, Robert's anguished confession hidden at the bottom of his filing cabinet. She had kept it, along with all the other documents from that terrible time, filed away in a folder marked Legal Matters Resolved, but she no longer read it late at night when sleep wouldn't come. She no longer tortured herself with wondering what she could have done differently. Instead, she focused on what she had learned, that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, that doing the right thing was its own reward, and that family wasn't just about blood relationships but about the people who showed up for you when life got difficult. Jennifer and Lucy had shown up. Harold Henderson had shown up. Even some of the neighbors and friends from church had rallied around her when they learned what had happened. She had lost one son, but she had gained a clearer understanding of who truly belonged in her inner circle. Margaret turned off the lamp and walked through her house, checking locks and turning off lights as she had done every night for 35 years. But tonight, the routine felt different. Tonight, it felt like a celebration of survival, of triumph, of the simple joy of being exactly where she belonged. In her bedroom, she changed into her nightgown and brushed her silver hair, looking at her reflection in the mirror that had witnessed decades of her life. The face looking back at her was older, more aligned than it had been at the beginning of this ordeal, but the eyes were clearer, more determined. She looked like a woman who had faced a crisis and emerged stronger on the other side. Before getting into bed, Margaret opened the drawer of her nightstand and pulled out a small leather journal. For the past month, she had been writing down her memories not just of the recent troubles, but of her entire life. Stories about growing up during the Depression, about nursing school and her early career, about meeting Robert and raising their children, about the joys and sorrows and ordinary miracles that make up a human life. She wrote about Robert's gentleness and humor, about the way he had sung off key in the shower and left little love notes in her lunch bag when she worked night shifts at the hospital. She wrote about the pride she had felt watching her children grow up, graduate from school, start families of their own. She wrote about the garden they had planted together and the dreams they had shared for their golden years, but she also wrote about the lessons she had learned in these past few months, about the importance of standing up for yourself even when it meant standing alone, about the difference between peace and justice, between forgiveness and enabling, about the courage required to love someone enough to hold them accountable for their actions. These were the stories she wanted to preserve, not just for Lucy but for all the generations that would come after. Someday, perhaps, David's children would want to know about their grandmother who had refused to be a victim. Someday, perhaps, David himself would be ready to hear about the strength and dignity that had carried his mother through the darkest period of her life. Margaret wrote for another hour, filling several pages with her careful handwriting, then closed the journal and set it aside. Tomorrow she would continue the story, adding new chapters about whatever adventures awaited her. Because she was beginning to understand that this wasn't the end of her story at all, it was a new beginning. She had thought that losing Robert meant the end of the life she had known and loved. She had thought that David's betrayal marked the beginning of a lonely decline into old age and irrelevance. But instead, she had discovered reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. She had forged deeper relationships with the people who truly mattered. She had found new purpose in sharing her wisdom with Lucy and others who needed to hear that it was possible to survive betrayal and emerge stronger. As Margaret settled into bed, pulling the quilt that she and Robert's mother had sewn together over her shoulders, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not for the pain she had endured, she wouldn't wish that on anyone, but for the strength she had discovered in herself, for the clarity that had emerged from confusion, for the love that had sustained her through the darkest nights. She thought about Lucy, probably fast asleep now in her own bed, the compass safely tucked away in her jewelry box like the treasure it was. Margaret smiled, imagining her granddaughter years from now, facing her own crossroads, pulling out that compass and remembering the story of an old woman who had refused to be defeated by circumstances or betrayed by people she trusted. True north, Margaret whispered into the darkness. The same words Robert had spoken to her on their wedding day when he had first given her the compass. Always find your way back to true north, and with that prayer, that promise, that legacy of love and courage. Margaret closed her eyes and slept peacefully, surrounded by the memories and hopes that filled her small house with more warmth and light than any mansion ever could. In her dreams, she was young again, walking hand in hand with Robert through the garden they had planted together, while somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of children's laughter, Lucy's voice, and perhaps the voices of children not yet born, all of them carrying forward the compass and the wisdom it represented, all of them finding their way back to true north. No matter how far they might wander or how lost they might feel, the story was finished, but its influence would continue for generations to come, and Margaret knew that was exactly as it should be.